Okay, then. Thank you very much, Belen, for introducing me such a kind way. Well, one of the things that I want to share with you, this is a lot of work done with many of my fellow collaborators, including Belena and Winifred, which are also in the audience. And I rather decided to present this topic because it's kind of rather new agenda, and it's related to the psychological and sociological process that has been happening in Chile. And I think it's a good example for social scientists to start thinking more broadly about how the context, the political context, the economical context, is also shaping our own psychological behavior and behavior. As you may know, Chile is a very slim country in South America. We're in a region in which there are a lot of social changes, and many countries have been facing numerous conflicts and political issues. And some of these countries have been facing critical issues, like in Venezuela, as you know. So for many years, our current president has been claiming that Chile is really the best country in the region. And we, to be honest, for many years, we start thinking we are the best in the region too. So that feeling of Chilean thinking themselves as a, more positive about the way we are. And I want to start this talk mentioning that happened in October 8, 2019. Then on Monday 14, the same year, the same month, from Monday to Wednesday, we start seeing one of the more prominent collective actions that start allegedly for a single tiny change in the prices of transport, the metro fare, buses. So they increased 30 pesos, which is, as you see in dollar, is a kind of tiny amount of money, but the meaning of this increase triggered a huge collective action by students, school students, in the metro station. On Thursday, that process escalates significantly when government decided to bring riot police to control for this collective action by kids from school. As you can see in the picture, that really fueled the conflict between them and the police. And on Friday, the very same week, we start inflamming and increasing the number of people now supporting the movement. So you start seeing protests in the metro station, outside the metro, but suddenly things become even more extreme. That radical group and radicalization of the movement is starting seen everywhere in the city. As an example, out of the 170 stations we have in the metro station, 80% of them were attacked, and several of them were completely burned, as this picture is showing. On Saturday that week, the state of emergency and the curfew was declared by the government. Winifred will remember this because we were invited to go for a conference in St. Andrew by Steve right here, a conference on collective action. Imagine I was arriving to Scotland when that was happening in Santiago, and I left Chile with nothing but a simple country where none of these movements were taking places. So you can see and imagine how difficult was the situation since we have this, what we call the outbreak of 2019. And I now want to think of how this issue emerged and what is our interpretation regarding contextual factors as well as psychological factors. And this is partly, we think, is connected to the development of Chile and poverty. Chile, during the last 28 years, has been increasingly, significantly developing as a country. You will see now several figures have been changing, impacting on population expectation about the future. Just to give you some figures, this is the income growth Back in the 80s, we recovered democracy about here. So that was per capita income, about 4,000, even less during this period. In the 80s, we faced one of the biggest crises, the crash. So this is the time when we recover democracy. Look at this, how much did it change the whole country in such a short term for a country. Then we see the reduction of extreme poverty and poverty. Generally, we were reaching 40% of poverty back in the 90s when we recovered democracy. And then both measures were really significantly reduced over the years. The secondary and tertiary education system also was severely impacted. We start seeing a lot of number of students increasing the education average. So large number of people were completing school, but also students' enrollment in higher education became very salient. If you look at this figure, that was the age when I started studying in psychology back in '86. So altogether, in the whole country, there were 200,000 people studying in higher education. Now we're reaching about 1,200,000 people. So that increase also increased the level of formation, expectation, education. That number also was connected to increased number of funding for the scholarship to allow people to go to higher education. However, those significant shifts in economic development, access to education, completing school, higher education, still remain a country in which heavy income disparity between the upper income population, even though you can see this gap is very heavy and is steadily going down, but it's still huge disparity between the more poor group. This is the first quintile, and the fifth. This is the gap that's really behind also this huge unsettle of the country. And this is the indicator of the Gini Index. As you may know, changing Gini Index is one of the difficult things for any given country. Though even we've been reducing this over the years, still is very high. And when we get into the OECD organization, we still remain as one of the highest level of inequality in the region. So there's still a lot of things to change. Even all this development was happening at the same time, people were also experiencing inequalities. And this is a figure that really, really shocked me when we report in 2019 the percentage of people who is in debt, increasing debt based on their income. 75% of their income in debt. So as you see, a lot of debt, a lot of expectation, more educated population, inequalities, all this combination of non-psychological but structural factors. And suddenly, for years, we start seeing or witnessing what we said, the dark side of the moon. This is a history of corruption in the military, but then collusion of private companies, very public issues, sexual abuse in different members of the church. Pharmacies collude to fix prices, collusion in different companies. Then the police involved in corruption, heavily corruption. So you start seeing a lot of this information coming in the media. And this figure, I don't know, probably you haven't seen any figure like this in any other country, but this is trust in institution over the years. Look at political parties. They're almost gone in the figure. Almost gone. The justice, the Congress, the government, all the institutions that used to be critical structure for supporting democracy are literally in the floor. People don't trust them all. The churches, even Catholics, evangelics, the police went down, armed forces, everyone. So distrust is the common ground in our context. So if you sum up all these things, you can start seeing huge demands for social change. So we start seeing this very early on, 2006, when protests start with massive school students. They were really massive. Then in 2011, college students start again re-emerging. Many of the leaders in this group in 2006 engaged as college students in the massive protests that start in 2011. Interesting enough, people from this generation facing these collective actions create later on a new political party. They are now MP members, and they are now facing the current presidential election with a high proportion of people supporting them, and probably with high chances of becoming president of Chile. So these collective actions have been extremely effective in increasing change in the political arena. This end up in this massive collective action in Chile 2 weeks later of this outbreak that I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk. This is categorized as the biggest ever collective action in Chile. 1.2 million people protesting, and they went into Santiago and any given city in the country. Protests were even fueled by different rhetorics coming from the president. When we start this in October 22, remember the critical collective action start 2019, October 14. So in less than 10 days, this collective action were heavily engaged for a lot of people on street. And unfortunately, our president claimed we are at the war. Imagine what that simple sentence create in collective actions. So the radicalization start to be present in different ways. On the one hand, we start seeing what we call the first line of protester. And if you imagine them, it's a group that emerged after we learned and we've been researching on this. They claim they were there supporting and helping the protester to play their role. So they were really policing and protecting their collective action. But on the other hand, we had police riot dealing with this protester. Obviously, as we know, that triggered a heavy intergroup dynamic, us between them. One of the major consequences that police using these elements to control for the crowds created a huge violation of human rights. So more than 365 people were having attack of their sight. They lose their visions, and there were a number of casualties affected by the use of force and extreme use of force. Actually, we were working in a way trying to address the government who were in charge of these police issues, and we start telling them about this research group that the effectiveness in which police authorities deal with the demand of the protests could actually facilitate or engage people to carry on more radical actions. So we start discussing with them. It's happened to me that I went to talk to the Interior Minister of the country and start talking about this research. I said, look, this is clearly what's going on here. Police is fostering and inducing this radicalization by the way they're facing this issue. So I talk about this John and Steve Reicher work, Clifford Stott, all this great work showing that the indiscriminate use of force is actually inducing protesters to perceive police as an illegitimate actor against whom it's necessary to fight. For my interest in and research agenda, we were considering that part of this effect was triggered by changing norms that were guiding their responses to this conflict, changing the norms in the dynamic that emerged within these collective actions. The legitimization of more radical action, such as the confronting police, occupation of public space, or damaging the properties, you can see everywhere in the media. Every day we were seeing and witnessing that kind of behavior. But unfortunately, the government was not really engaged, even if we try to connect people from Clifford Group to deal with this issue. Unfortunately, they stopped this process, and we couldn't manage to engage in any actions to stop the way police were facing this issue. Other issue that was also, we think, impacting the norms was the proliferation of images of videos. A lot of mass media and social networks were really playing a role, portraying, for instance, indiscriminate use of force by the police against protesters that also increased radicalization. So I just wanted to learn about that experience because we thought norms are real psychological factor playing an important issue here. Also because norms, we think, are connected to this interdynamic issue that involves group of protesters and the police. Now, for that reason, we start connecting our own research. And to be honest, this is the unpredictable but positive situation that happened once in a life. Because we were with Belen and Winnie, we were researching, following a group of college students for several years in different ways, understanding collective action over time, to study factors that predict and consequences of being involved in collective actions. So getting change over time. But suddenly we have the outbreak here, the 18th of October situation. So we managed to get an additional measure. We contact the ethical committee and we asked for permission to contact our sample again once the outbreak took place. So we have that important event, external contextual event, just to see how much these people who were participating in different levels over time were actually affected by this strong external factor. So this is one of the research that I want to share with you now. And just to give you a flavor of the measure we use for differentiating between conventional actions like participating in discussion meetings, spread information in the social network, attending marches or protests, versus radical actions like confronting the police in protests, participating in barricades, and so forth. So one of the things we did to describe this process was simply looking at the means, just simply following them in these two kind of different collective action measures. As you see, there are variations over times. We know, as very common, radical actions are less frequent compared to conventional ones, but we can see how much that event triggered a change in the pattern of both groups. So then we decided to ask whether within these particular groups is any differential pattern for those people who were engaged here in the conventional or the radical group. Could we assume they were homogeneous over time? So we decided to run latent class analysis to try to see whether we might describe different groups. And yes, we did find differential groups. So we distinguish between those people who were actively involved systematically over time and those who were quite low, engaging in collective action in conventional ones, and somehow other in between the groups. Obviously, the majority of them were here, the more less active. But interesting enough, that was the group who mobilized with the central group, mobilized so strongly after the outbreak. So this is really, really interesting how much this affect. So we immediately start thinking, well, what psychological factor was connected to this? So because we were measuring over the years, we have some of this measure. And we start looking at very common emotions that are relevant for this. And this is, interesting enough, the connection between these three forms of behavior and anger. Anger was connected to significantly explaining change over time. So anger increased, especially when we have this collective outbreak. But also, we start considering an idea that people in the Netherlands have been talking a lot about, this idea of nothing to lose. Is the sense of feeling that you've been really facing so dramatic condition that there's nothing we can lose. So we should move forward. And that's also a predictor of engages in collective action. And as you can see, that steady positive connection is also connected to our change in the pattern. Injecting norms. To what extent my friends that attend this protest are also encouraging me, fostering me to go. Again, we can see how much the difference is between these three groups. So an increased number of friends supporting them also was connected to different levels. But again, this outbreak produced particular changes in this group. And even having contact with other people attending this protest also was, again, connected to these differential patterns. Then we look at the collective action in the radical form, and now you will see radicalization is rather slow. 85% of people were not engaging, or really low level of them. But again, 11% of them in the middle. So about 50% of them were engaged in really radical actions. As you can see, this was particularly a group who again shifted significantly after the outbreak. Anger was heavily connected to all of them. But again, this group who were low activists in radicalization were also experiencing high level of anger that even equalized them with the whole group here. Here we were consistently different over time. The idea of nothing to lose, again, this group was suddenly becoming more radicalization over time. And as you see again, the same pattern. So the role of norm, anger, and conception of the idea of nothing to lose. Russell Spear, by the way, is the person who's been working on this idea. Again, we're connected to these ideas. Now, as you see, contact, friendship are again connected to this idea. So the conventional radical actions were studied following this group. From that group, we make a subgroup of people in which we were also lucky because we were selecting an activist group that we start measuring every other week over time, because we were interested in focusing on a specific psychological process that explain change over time. But again, we have this outbreak, so we were able to measure 10 times the very same participants. Look at the number of years are pretty stable. And after we complete the 10 waves, we add another 10 more. So in this group now we have 27 waves of participants. If we sum up the previous waves plus this 20. So that would allow us to really focus attention on this kind of activist group over time. But I just wanted to see what happened with this group. Again, pretty much the same story as before. These two groups were activists, in which the radical action were lower than this. We knew that in advance. even though their trends, the slope, were rather negative. But look at what's happened, the shift this activist group did after the outbreak, and increases significant level again, and I drop down until quite the same as they were previously at the very beginning. So I talk about the dynamic process that this critical factor induced in this particular group. And again, we follow the same methodology, and we start seeing whether within this group there are some variations. And as you can see, the pattern is rather different. This 48% of the sample were actually the ones who were kind of resemble the activists or very active people when we have or faced the outbreak after October. But then it became more radicalized as compared to the baseline over here. So that event really, really triggered a significant signal for participants over the time. And this is for the radical action, pretty much the same, except that after several months, that went down significantly, as we were expecting, because remember, this group was very similar to this one. So that let us know that the role of norms seems to be so important. And we have so much evidence in psychology with the very old-fashioned studies, Solomon, Ash, Milgram, so many interesting work done to show the importance of norms. We know how important are the social network in which we rely to build our interactions, how many sources of normative influence like family, peers, authorities are so strong in shaping our own behavior. Obviously, individuals, because we interact with our group behavior, my family as a group, my political group members, other groups are so influential in terms of affecting my own behavior. So we decided to connect this idea of descriptive and injective norm as a sort of influences our own participation in collective action. This research, and Gini has been heavily involved, as you probably well known in your group, revealed that stronger effect seems to be important considering both kind of norm. To what extent you see others that they want you to do so, or the simple fact of seeing others that are relevant to you doing that behavior. For that reason, we thought connecting norms with collective action seems to be a relevant issue to address. And here we deal with this family influential role, because family in the socialization, political literature show how important is family for shaping political development, children's political standpoint. And obviously we thought, well, if family is so important for shaping political attitudes, why should it be the case for shaping collective actions? So if I belong to a member or to a family in which my parents are engaged in collective actions or were engaged in the past, how much that could influence my own behavior? So that was the kind of topic that we're really interested in, because we didn't see very much research on that issue. So this research that I'm going to show you now is connecting the relationship of parents and their children participating in collective actions. And this is a recent paper we just published in this journal, and in which Gini, as I said, and Belen were really involved. And it's regarding the context of the dictatorship in Chile. We basically enrolled 100 parents with the 100 kids. Those parents were actively involved against dictatorship in Pinochet's time. So we knew that some of their kids were very active in the present, and others were not really involved in collective action with different levels. So the idea was, we thought that children's participation in the present will be connected to parents' participations. That would imply what parents did in the past, how much that could connect with perception of injective norms, to what extent they might want their kids to do the same? Or current participation. Are those parents who were actively involved in the past are actively involved in the present? How much those kind of behavior, past and present, could trigger expectation about the kids? So if I grew up in an environment in which I think my parents want me or they expect me to do, would that affect my own behavior? Or kids are rather independent of what their parents think about that? Well, we measure collective actions, normative, and again, collective and radical actions. And obviously, we also measure the perception of kids regarding their parents. So we ask parents about what they expect about the kids, and we ask their kids what they think their parent value or not, then participating in collective actions. So that we run independent interviews, and then we connect this data. And that was the main outcome. So here we have collective action and participation in radical actions on top. The blue boxes represent the children's participation. And then we got the red boxes who, connect parents' participation. So what we found was the more parents participate in the past, obviously that predict parent participation in the present. So activist parents carry on being active parents in the present. Interesting enough, those two measures, for us, they correspond to the descriptive measure for the children's. They were predicting parents' expectation about their daughter or son participation. So their expectation was a critical issue for us. To what extent having that expectation was in any way connected to their children's behavior? And the answer is yes. Children's behavior were connected to parents' expectation through the children's injunctive family norm. So in a way that the more you perceive your parent participating, increases the perception of children that they, parents, want them or value them participating. That effect, however, did not work in the same fashion for radical action. And we think partly because radicalization is more extreme. And normally, parents are more concerned when the kids become more involved in radical actions. So we thought that injunctive norm was particularly relevant for conventional action. Then we went to replicate this in a second study in which we were, remember, measuring over time this measure. But here are all students speaking about their parents. So to what extent they perceive their parent participating actually in current movement, to what extent they think they value them participating in injunctive norms, and actually how much they, the student, participate in collective action. We did this longitudinally. So we have the methodological tools to capitalize from this longitudinal. So we took this autoregressive effect, and then we start looking at our prediction. First, as the previous studies, perceiving my parent participating was enough for triggering prediction of own participation. And that happened over time. Secondly, perception of parent participating also predicted children's injunctive family norms. So seeing my parents made me think they value me participating. Interesting enough, we found this mediation effect. So this injunctive norm mediate the relationship between parent descriptive norm over participation over time. We also find the opposite cross-lag effect. So in such a way that injunctive and descriptive norm are also influencing each other. Then we compare pretty much the same effect when we look at for radical action. Pretty much the same effect. Then we jump into a national representative sample study in which, as you notice, we become obsessive about longitudinal studies. So we start collecting 10 years longitudinal sample study. And this is what we call the social conflict and cohesion study. We just finished that way. And imagine this outbreak plus the pandemic affecting in different ways our longitudinal panel. Interesting enough, that wave was captured right after the outbreak. Indeed, we were start collecting data that very week, but we postponed it because of the collective action 1 month later. So we have now new data, including that wave. But this paper focused on the first 3 waves. And again, we are now seeing this is general population, to what extent you report your family and friends participating in collective action, different ones, supporting minority groups, indigenous group movement, females, equality movements, and so forth. So the more you perceive your family members is influencing your perception of efficacy, the more you start thinking you are able to change things. And to what extent efficacy is affecting my own participation, it did affect your participation over time. So efficacy was mediating the effect of perceived family friends norm on participation over time again. It's pretty much the same methodology. We also have an effect between participation and family friends norm. My own participation increasing my perception that my family and friends are also participating again. So norms start to be a critical factor. Seeing my parents, seeing my friends, or perceiving they want me to, made me increase my sense of feelings that I'm able to change things, or made me feel they want me to be involved. So that factors were affecting my own behavior. So as a whole, collective action and social change is an enduring phenomenon around the world. Development and unfulfilled expectations seem to be very clear. When you read all this media covering this movement, social inequality, injustice, perception of differential status, social class issues, racism, all these issues everywhere. Social inequality, distrust in the government, political parties, fear of vulnerability, uncertainty. If you look at this concept, are in the background of these massive collective actions. Anger, emotion, contempt, perception of abuse, collusion. Imagine it's a perfect storm to induce this social change and social collective action. So in a way, we shouldn't be surprised of seeing such a radicalization process, particularly regarding the role of police, when they were inducing new norms in the way they were related to the crowd. Understanding the role of the dynamic as an intergroup phenomenon rather simply as an emergence of simply anger or emotions in the current protest movement. So emotion, conception, perception, distrust, all these concepts are something really important that we need to focus attention. The outbreak is also fueling radical and conventional action. So we should consider this contextual factor as critical components of social change. We know that the intergenerational transmission of collective action is really playing a role. We were witnessing parents and grandparents going to protests, and they claimed we don't want the new generations to face the same problem that we were facing. This, by the way, is been triggering a lot of the change that we are now currently discussing in political terms. As you may know, I don't know if you know, but we have a national convention now working in producing the new constitution of the country. That was the political agreement reached after the outbreak to deal with this crisis. So all this process of friends, family members engaging in this action, we thought were kind of recreating new norms about these interactions. So seeing other people protesting, seeing my friends call my attention on my group to think, well, norms are operating the same way across different social movements. Now have a look at this. I think collective action is a global phenomenon. Look at these examples. You probably know about the story of the rapist in your path. That was a group which started in Santiago, in Valparaiso, in a city, as a 3 women who create a song regarding the females' collective actions. And that movement was spread all over the world, in different countries. It's a very strong lyrics and song regarding the way that dominant males have been abusing, and this metaphor of the dominant power of male over females that explain discrimination, sexual abuse, and so forth. So that effect was spread all over. I think that's partly the effect of norms. The HM movement. I don't know if you've seen this movement. I'm mapping. I just take this image from internet. So in Madrid, in Santiago, look at the huge movement. But it's not there only in Spain, in different cities in Africa, in Europe, everywhere. So the Hong Kong protester, the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protester, all of these events, we think we need to put attention to what extent they are signaling and guiding our own movements. We need to consider this broad context when understanding this process. Thank you very much.